everyone to today's discussion. This is the last Samvaad dialogue for the semester. Samvaad is a student-run initiative of the Center for New Economic Studies that is organized with a vision to have a more accessible, decentralized platform for students to connect with distinguished scholars and thinkers for critical reflection on existing social, political, and economic realities that are observable in context to contemporary India and the rest of the developing world. All members of our core research team participate in the forum, along with students and faculty members. The broader purpose of each Samvaad dialogue is to encourage a more informed process of a collective discussion, which helps in creating a process of ideation among students, enabling them to further push the envelope in research and pick upon new areas of study in and across social sciences. The discussion is conducted in a form of a moderated interaction. It would be conducted over the course of the first 45 to 50 minutes, and two broader themes will be discussed. In the moderated interaction, each theme will feature some questions, soliciting responses from our distinguished guests. Post that, we open the discussion space for the audience to invite questions around the themes addressed. For this, the questions by the audience would be read out from the chat box. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished guest today. Professor Ramachandra Guha is a historian, sociologist, and a biographer on Gandhi based out of Bangalore. Professor Guha has authored and contributed to more than 30 books. His pioneering contributions to environmental history include The Unquiet Woods, How Much Should a Person Consume, and Savaging the Civilized. Professor Guha's renowned book, India After Gandhi, was chosen as the Book of the Year by The Economist, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal, and as the Book of the Decade in the Times of London and The Hindu. His most recent work is a 2-volume biography on Mahatma Gandhi. The first volume, Gandhi Before India, was chosen as a notable book of the year by the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. His second volume, Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World, was chosen as a notable book of the year by the New York Times and The Economist. He also frequently writes on the history of cricket. Professor Guha has received several accolades, including the Leopold Hiddy Prize of the American Society of Environmental History, the Daily Telegraph Cricket Society Prize, the Malcolm Adisha Award for Excellence in Social Science Research, the Ramnath Goenka Prize for Excellence in Journalism, the Sahitya Akademi Award, and the Fuqua Prize for Contribution to Asian Studies. It is an honor to have you here today, sir. I would now like Professor Deepanshu Mohan to kindly take over the discussion.
Right, thank you, Ada. This is truly I would say an honor and also a very amazing opportunity for our students to get a chance to hear and listen. Of course, if not in personal presence, but virtually to Professor Guha. Some of us have had the privilege of being in the same classroom as part of a seminar course he was doing. I think this was back in 2011, 2012 in LSE. So it's after a while we are connecting, and it's a wonderful chance, as I said, for those who would like to ask any questions for Professor Guha to put those out in the chat box. We'll relay these across once a part of the moderated interaction gets over. So with Samvaad, as Ada has mentioned, we try to have a platform for, of course, students, young scholars like ourselves to have a chance to discuss what seems to be important as part of a contemporary social, political, and economic reality that's affecting not only the lives of citizens, let's say, back in India, but also generally get a better perspective of understanding on areas we can identify as what you would consider as intersectional research questions for developing a sense of scholarship, which is allowing people across disciplines to get in touch. So as part of most of the work that we have highlighted, and the individuals who have come in to speak, none of them actually have been for the same discipline. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is to get different perspectives to come in. And over a period of time, as what the center does, is to see how you can develop a more participative and also interdisciplinary perspective in not just talking and conversing, but also in research in terms of methodological tools. I want to get started very quickly because we have a ground to cover. And thank you again, guys, for working hard and behind the scenes to get this organized. There are a few things that we wanted to get started, sir, with your permission. I want to start right away with a quote from a column that came out, I think, early this morning with Telegraph, something that you published. I want to get a start because there are a few themes that we want to look at as part of our conversation over the next 40 to 45 minutes, and then open it up for conversation with everyone. The first thing is, and I'm reading from a quote, from the column where you quote or cross quote Ashish Khaitan, whose book Undercover: My Journey into the Darkness of Hindutva is something you're kind of reflecting on. And the quote says as follows: majoritarian rule, untrammeled by law, the veneer of democracy minus the substance of constitutionalism, the constant undermining of minorities, particularly Muslims, the impunity for Hindu right-wing writers as opposed to the harsh treatment, including unjustified arrests and imprisonment meted out to those deemed to be on the opposing ideological side, the persecution of activists and human rights organizations, the misuse and abuse of institutional and judicial processes to target political opponents and dissidents, the systematic manner in which Modi exploits the power of the state to crush any opposition, the sheer scale of state persecution is without precedent in India. Now, just if as a short experiment in a historical role play exercise, in your own reading as a historian, how would the four founding fathers of modern India, those who you have articulated in your work, right, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar, and just for our audience to understand, you chose these, I think, using criteria of quality of their prose, the ideas and how they've traveled across generations and reflections that carry across, time and space. How would they respond to what you think is the state of the Republic today?
Yeah. So thank you, Deepanshu, and thank you everyone for being here. Before I answer your question, I want to reflect on the Ashish Khaitan quote which you read out, which is from my article in the Telegraph today. And I agree with almost all of it. Democracy untrammeled by constitutionalism, explicit majoritarianism, suppression of dissent, and so on and so forth. But Khaitan says at the end is unprecedented in India. And I slightly dissent from that in the next paragraph of my article, where I recall the emergency. So in the emergency, there was the similar abuse of public institutions to subserve the interests of a ruling party and a particular leader, Indira Gandhi in that case. There was a sharp and, how do I put it, almost total suppression of dissent. But there wasn't a majoritarian team. So in that sense, this is, politically, it's not as bad as the emergency. Comparisons with the emergency are quite common nowadays. But there are also some departures. During the emergency, the BJP, the Congress was in power in almost all the states. Now, as I say in my article, the Congress is not in power in many states. But the majoritarian tinge is, to my mind, a stark and dangerous departure even from the emergency itself. Now, Deepanshu, parents are often disappointed in their children. Great companies go into decline. I'm not sure what Jamshedji Tata would have thought about the Tatas today, or the Sarabhais would have thought of the state of the Sarabhais today. So, it's inevitable that founders would be disappointed. Of course, Tagore, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Nehru are no longer alive. So one can't say what they would have thought. But from what we know of their work, they were trying to create a very different kind of India. They wanted to create an India built on a system of values, not on a sense of majoritarian Hindu supremacy, nor on the demonization of minorities, nor on characterizing certain countries as enemies, nor on shutting oneself off from the rest of the world and claiming that Hindu thought was immeasurably superior in all respects. Now, one of the great achievements of the Indian National Congress, forgotten now, was bringing women into public life. In 1925, Sarojini Naidu became president of the Indian National Congress at a time when women were invisible in politics in the so-called advanced democracies of the world in Europe and North America. Now, I've been thinking about that historic anointment of Sarojini Naidu as president of the Indian National Congress 100 years ago, when reading recently about our precipitous fall in the global gender gap report. We've fallen about, I think, 20 odd places in the last year. There's a very good recent book, I'll just show it to you, edited by the economist Nisha Agarwal, which I've been just dipping into. It's a comprehensive survey of the status of women in India today across economics, law, culture, society, and it does not make for happy reading. So, if our constitution makers wanted an open society, wanted tolerance of different views and beliefs and perspectives, wanted gender and caste equality, I think we're very far away from achieving those ideals. And of course, I would not blame one leader and one party. It's this process of decline started in the last UPA. The attrition of institutions, the attacks on their integrity and their autonomy goes back to Indira Gandhi's time, which is 40 years ago. It is tragic that our press does not have a spine, that our judiciary wavers on important decisions. So when you have institutional decline, which has social, economic, cultural consequences, one should not single out merely one individual or one party in accounting for this decline. But it's, again, so if I may go back to the example of Sarojini Naidu, and then I'll end my answer to this question, Deepanshu. In 1925, it was inconceivable for women to be active in Chinese public life. China was far more patriarchal than India at that stage. Today, if you travel in China, you'll see gender equality having progressed much, much further than us. So why is it that our visionaries, our freedom fighters, our social reformers were so prescient in the late 19th and early 20th century, and we of the current generation have not carried on their work, have abandoned their work? Again, if I may quote a recent article by an Indian author, Pallavi Iyer, who is a journalist who's lived extensively in China, recently wrote a very interesting piece, which I tweeted, comparing the status of women in China and India. And one of the illustrations she gave actually resonated with me. It's about the ubiquity of women as bus drivers in China. So an absolute defying of gender stereotypes. Train drivers, bus drivers. You would never find that in India. So I think these are aspects of our everyday life where we have manifestly failed the founders of the Republic, and we should reflect upon it. You're mute, Deepanshu. You're mute.
Yeah, no, and see, just this is a question which we kind of frame, trying to kind of, also understand what position we are in. I want to kind of dig a little deeper into one of the founding fathers of modern India who you've written and talked about. That's Tagore, and we have the Bengal elections in full swing at this point, and we see this constant appropriation of each of our thinkers or leaders, writers in different forms of election. And I want to again start with just a short quote for our audience from I think an introduction you wrote for Tagore's Nationalism. And yeah, and you have to see Tagore's reputation within India and outside it has suffered, you say, and I'm quoting you here, from his being made a pericule position of one province, that's Bengal. It was in Bengali that he wrote his poems, novels, plays, and songs, works that are widely read and regularly performed 7 decades after his death. The poet Subhas Mukhopadhyay recalls, and I quote him here, a time when the elite of Bengal fought among themselves to monopolize Tagore they tried to seal off Tagore, cordoning him away from the hoi polloi. He adds, there was another trend serving the same purpose but in a different way. In the name of ideology and as the sole representative of the masses, some tried to protect the proletariat from the bourgeoisie poet's harmful influence, and the Bengali communists have since taken back their hostility to Tagore. I'm talking, this is a column he wrote back in 2011. It's not a very recent. So I want to just very quickly ask you, and I can go on and on because you also go on to talk about Ravi Shankar's.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is that? Why is that after all these years, we see that Tagore's own ideas and views, for example, on nationalism and other writings, the writings which are not as part of his literary work, do not reach, let's say, the larger base of India's social and political milieu. And what happens is the geographical diminution of the man, who suffered from this parochial possession, is still isn't part of our collective socio-political imagination.
It's a very good question, Deepanshu. It's a more broader problem. Just as the Bengalis have parochialized Tagore, unfortunately, Ambedkar has become a Dalit icon alone. Ambedkar has things to say for all of us. And he wrote, of course, insightfully and searingly about the injustice of the caste system. But he wrote very insightfully about many other subjects as well. Federalism, the rule of law, economic policy. Nehru has been made the property of the Congress party and indeed of one family. And the rest of us are prevented from seeing the wide range of his thought. Now, Tagore was a visionary. Tagore was, I would put it this way, Tagore was a Bengali deeply curious and interested in other parts of India. He traveled in many other parts of India. He spent time in my home state of Karnataka, in the Himalaya, in Ahmedabad, written about it. And he was an Indian deeply interested in and curious about other parts of the world. In that sense, he was a model in being rooted and being cosmopolitan at the same time. He also was, I mean, spending the last month reading Tagore in translation and trying to understand his environmental views, Deepanshu. He was a precocious environmentalist. In the 1910s and 20s, he was writing about the importance of nature conservation. He was writing about imperialism as a system of ecological and resource exploitation. He was getting agricultural experts to Shantiniketan to start programs of sustainable agricultural development. Right. So he was also, even though he was a poet, and his poetry is redolent with the beauty and mystique of nature, he was also an intensely pragmatic man trying to help the peasants of Bengal work out a more sustainable economic model. So he was an extraordinarily wide-ranging figure who, because he's been, as I quote Ravi Shankar there, the Bengalis have kept him too close to their chest. But I'm glad that Tagore is part of the conversation in the ongoing election campaigning, and both sides are free to represent and misrepresent Tagore as they wish. But I urge younger Indians to start reading Tagore's non-fiction writings. Now, there's some very good compilations of his work. Like Gandhi, some of Tagore's best writings is in letters to his friends. And there's two lovely collections of his letters. One edited by the historian Uma Dasgupta, which is Tagore's letters to C.F. Andrews and Gandhi. And the other is only his letters to Gandhi, edited by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. Sahitya Academy has put out some excellent compilations of his non-fiction. His great work, Nationalism, is now available in a Penguin Classics edition, to which I've been privileged to write the introduction. So I think we need to take Tagore out of the Bengali ghetto, and we need to see Ambedkar, again, as I said, as much more than as a Dalit icon. One of the advantages that Gandhi has had, Deepanshu, is that no sectarian group has claimed him. Bose is a Bengali, Shivaji is a Maharashtrian, Tagore is a Bengali, Ambedkar is a Dalit. But Gandhi, fortunately, defies such sectarian claiming. So all of us, regardless of where you come from, there's a kind of audience for him. There's a critical audience for him. It's not that all Indians admire him. I mean, some have deep reservations about some of his ideas. But I think Tagore and Ambedkar should be taken out of, you could say, the sectarian silos in which their admirers have placed them. In particular, I think that would be, it's long. I mean, it took me a long time to come to Tagore, because I grew up in Dehradun opposite the Bengali house. And Rabindra Sangeet was playing all the time. And that put me off Rabindra Sangeet because the only music I heard was Rabindra Sangeet. So then I went to Calcutta, and then my professors were Marxists, who, as Subhash Mukhopadhyay said, dismissed Tagore as a bourgeois. So it took me a long time to come to Tagore, but I've now spent a great deal of my effort trying to read him, understand him, and deeply appreciate him. I mean, his environmental writing is absolutely prophetic. His warnings against jingoism, of course, are well known and are contained in his book Nationalism. But his environmental writings speak to the crisis caused by climate change today.
And is there someone else who you would want to highlight as part of the work, let's say, in the context of Bengal? Like someone, like for our students, for example, who haven't been familiar with, let's say, most of what I know you mentioned about Aurobindo and a few others.
One person I'd like to mention very much is Mohan Roy. The first liberal reformer that modern India produced. And I think again, Mohan Roy was a deeply learned man. His first book was in Persian with an Arabic forward. And of course, his first language is Bangla, and he knew fluent Sanskrit. So he was completely grounded in Indian culture. But he recognized when we were colonized by the West that this represented a profound challenge and an invitation for us to look inwards as to why had we been colonized and what were our own weaknesses and deficiencies. And there were three, so to say, aspects of Ram Mohan Roy's work, which are very important. One was to end discrimination against women. He was not a full-fledged feminist in the way which we understand feminism in the 21st century. But as an early 19th century Hindu, he was conscious that Hindu women were discriminated against on such stuff as, widow remarriage and stuff like that. The second thing he spoke very insightfully about was the freedom of the press. He wrote a tract in the 1820s telling the British colonial government to loosen their restrictions on the press. And he gave a very interesting argument, which was not just moral, that we need free flow of information, but also pragmatic, that the ruler needs to know his critics. If the ruler is confronted with his critics, he'll be a better ruler. I mean, I'm convinced that if Narendra Modi was to abandon his preference and for one-way dialogue and have an unscripted monthly press conference with half a dozen smart journalists and reporters, not polemicists or party people, but journalists who understand ground reality, he would feedback. Having a feedback loop is very important for a ruler. And so I think his writings on the freedom of the press. And finally, the importance he stressed on modern scientific education. In the whole unfolding of the pandemic, there's been a lot of spurious information spread by our so-called medicine men and our holy men about how to treat corona, right? And Ram Mohan Roy's emphasis on modern scientific education, I think, is also relevant. So I think he would be someone who is not very well known today. Some of his writings are in English. There are a couple of good books about him. But you see, Bengal produced many great patriots. Subhash Bose and Aurobindo were great patriots. So, one salutes them for their commitment and their zeal and their spirit of sacrifice and struggle. But if you're talking about thinkers from the past who speak to our predicament today, I'd say Ram Mohan Roy and Tagore speak much more directly to the challenges India confronts today than either Subhash Bose or Aurobindo.
Yeah, Yeah. No, I think that's a point well taken. I want to bring us back to the national level scenario, and just there were a few pointers there that I wanted to get your thoughts on more in reflection, because you've written prolifically about these over the last, at least I would say, since the CA NRC kind of protest movement of sorts started coming in. There was a lot that was coming in to understand what is happening. How do you see and sense, and this is a question which is something that you also, again, I think, put out in the uh, column you wrote today, which is on the Gujarat model going national, you know, and what forces in your, see, I mean, as someone who has an understanding of not just history, but other areas of our social history as well, and political history since independence. I know you've mentioned this so many times, that the existence of such a complex, distinctive democratic regime qualifies as, what you mentioned again and again, as one of the world's bona fide political miracles that India, in its democratic structure, used to have. Now, there is a quote again, and just I want to get your thoughts on where and how, in your understanding, has contributed for this, quest for total power in Gujarat, which was seen for almost, a decade and a half. Uh, Modi and Shah had three sets of allies that you mentioned about: a committed civil service and police force, a pliant and propagandist media, and a submissive judiciary. And in the brackets, you mentioned, of the courts of Gujarat, because there are a lot of students of law and faculty members of law here who might be present. Ashish Khaitan mentions that how he experienced at first hand the nadir of our criminal justice system, a subversion of what justice means and should mean to ordinary citizens. So what, in your understanding, has over the last, because it's something which we are working on right now as a part of our thesis, on the contributing factors that socioeconomically led to, the rise of a certain form of conservative thought and leadership, right? Which is, whether it's right-wing extremism or whatever you can see or call it. What forces, in your understanding, has contributed to this?
So I will come to that, but first I want to focus. I'll come to where you ended your question, on what are the forces that have led to the rise of right-wing religious consolidation. But I'd just like to rewind a bit to the quote from my paragraph, where you quoted me accurately as saying that in their quest for total power in Gujarat, Modi and Shah had three sets of allies: a committed civil service, a pliant and propagandist media, and a submissive judiciary. Now, in her quest for total power in India in the mid-1970s, Indira Gandhi had the same three set of allies. Okay, so I think that's important to recognize, that this kind of urge for centralization and total domination and subversion of democratic institutions is not new. We've been there before. So Indira Gandhi also had those three sets of allies: a committed civil service, a propagandist media, and a submissive judiciary. But what she did not have was a majoritarian tinge to her policies and her program. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes the current moment so dangerous. Right. Now, we are becoming a majoritarian state. Why is this happening? Now, part of the reason this is happening is, of course, the failures, and not to be too polite, the crimes of the Congress regimes that preceded the current Modi regime. Manmohan Singh could have certainly constituted the Sachar committee. Muslims are vulnerable and discriminated against in many respects. Their access to dignified employment, fair treatment is a matter of question. But when Manmohan Singh said minorities will have the first claim on our resources, that is an open invitation, that to the charge of minority appeasement. Rajiv Gandhi bears an even greater, burden for enabling the rise of Hindutva through the Shah Banu judgment, which must be I'm sure widely discussed in the General Law School, which was a great moment with 400 MPs in Parliament, with a liberal face, Muslim face in his own cabinet to bring about a common civil law for everyone, a gender-friendly common civil law for everyone, regardless of religion. Rajiv Gandhi also, as is well known, opened the locks to the Ayodhya temple. That issue was closed, but he opened the locks to the temple, giving rise to the popular movement for its so-called liberation. And now, of course, there's a ripple effect even in Varanasi, where that dispute was opened afresh. The other thing that Rajiv Gandhi did, by the way, in terms of Muslim appeasement, was, which is less well known now, but was not insignificant at the time, was to ban Salman Rushdie's satanic verses even before Ayatollah Khomeini had done so in Iran. Right. So there's several things. One is this sense, obviously, Muslim appeasement by the Congress Party. Then this deep, on the kind of more on the driving side, you could say on the kind of motivation side, this sense that we must become a great Hindu nation, we must reclaim our heritage from the past. I mean, the whole RSS point of view, which is that India was contaminated and weakened and divided by centuries of European and Muslim domination. Now, this kind of view is given sustenance and support by the fact that we live in a region of majoritarian nation states. Pakistan and Bangladesh are Islamic majoritarian states. Burma and Sri Lanka are Buddhist majoritarian states. India was the exception. In fact, just as India's survival as an electoral democracy was an anomaly among the ex-colonial countries of Asia and Africa, India's explicit presentation of itself as a non-theocratic, multi-denominational state was in defiance of the South Asian norm. The South Asian norm is you fuse faith and state. That's what Pakistan did. That's what Bangladesh did. That's what Sri Lanka has done. That's why Sri Lanka had such a bloody civil war, because Tamils felt that they were second class, both on grounds of language and on grounds of religion. Right. Look at what's happening in Myanmar with the persecution of Muslim minorities now, but earlier on, the persecution of the hill tribes, by the majority Buddhist population of the river valleys. So I think there are a variety of reasons why but it's very bad, not just for our social fabric, it's very bad for our economic prospects. What I worry about India today is that 15 years ago, we were on the path to becoming a middle-income country. Hundreds of millions of Indians were being lifted out of poverty. There was free movement across India. There was a dynamism among our entrepreneurs. Minorities were feeling secure. Women were advancing in different spheres of life. Now we have regressed over the last 10 or 15 years. And the slide started in the second term of the UPA. I mean, I think it didn't begin with Modi. It's accelerated under Modi, but it started the second of the UPA. Every index we are slipping. I mean, the gender gap index, we are now down to 140. Press freedom, you just look at pollution, the worst. One of the striking failures of the Modi government is that in 7 years, they've done nothing to clean up the air around Delhi. Why is this? Is it only to give the state government run by another party a bad name? So I think the environmental costs of air pollution are horrific and borne largely by the poor. So I think by this obsession with making India Hindu, by cultivating a sense of Hindu pride and great glory, that we were ruling the world in the past and we are destined to rule the world in the future, and we will do so if we recover and restore and rehabilitate our Hindu pride. Just by saying, "Garv se kaho Hindu hai, we will come to rule the world," is a kind of summit system of Hindutva ideology. Hindutva ideology has only two elements. One is Garv se kaho Hindu ho, and those who are not Hindus are suspect and have to prove their loyalty and their patriotism whenever we ask them. Right. Now, this can never make a country great. This can only create fear, insecurity, paranoia. If you have lack of trust, for example, if you have a subordinate of the legal system, you will If you do not have trust in the legal system, you cannot have fair play in the economy, and you cannot, unleash the forces of the market. So I think there are a variety of reasons for the rise and consolidation of Hindutva majoritarianism, and there are a variety of mostly negative consequences that will flow from it, which younger Indians must be aware.
I mean, we in economics, there is this idea of using externalities as a way of understanding the unintended effects of a given action. Let's say the actions of two people on a third party or one person on another. And just, before I get into just as a quick follow up, do you see a positive externality, to what's happening in India today? Because there's something which you mentioned. I remember this listening to somewhere where you've talked about this, that history is not just about the history of power, or the colonizer. It's also about the resistance to power.
Yeah.
So there's something which you see at this point of time that, yes, a lot of things were maybe taken for granted. These civic freedoms and the miracle that we were a part of, right. Maybe we somewhere took the fact that our own multilingual ethno-linguistic fragmentation is some kind of a social safety net, which is what is going to safely guard any form of core centralization of power and its tendency. Do you see there is something that we are coming out at this point of time as some kind of an effect where you're seeing, particularly the young? I think the CA and RC movement was the protest movement was a very good signaling effect on that. And I was pleasantly surprised to see how many Ambedkar posters were there complimenting Gandhi, which is to kind of, say that people are kind of now more and more appreciating the work of Ambedkar and the tools he gave, for people to stand up for their rights. So what is your, if I'm kind of not looking at just the doomsday scenario, what are the...
So I think, so I'm glad you mentioned that the Ambedkar poster, and Ambedkar next to Gandhi. One of the problems with the Indian intellectual class is the polarization of Gandhi versus Ambedkar. Of Nehru versus Patel. Gandhi and Ambedkar had disagreements because they came to the problem of the abolition of untouchability from different perspectives. A guilt-ridden upper caste reformer and an emancipator who had experienced oppression himself, right? But actually, they are allies. Posthumously, they are allies. We need them both. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tagore, Nehru are all broadly on the same side. Against Savarkar and Golwalkar and Islamic fundamentalists and Naxalites on the other. So I think a more inclusive pantheon. I think those who want to nurture, restore Indian democracy to what it was supposed to be should stop polarizing Nehru versus Patel. The Nehru versus Patel polarization was started by the Congress party. The Congress party disowned Patel because Sonia Gandhi named everything after, Rajiv and Indira and Nehru, and hence allowed the BJP to disown Patel. But Nehru and Patel, despite their disagreements, worked together to build a united India and give it a democratic template, along with Ambedkar, who also suppressed his earlier disagreements with the Congress party to work heroically in the first cabinet. So today, when we are confronted with this majoritarian monster, I think the sectarian debates and disputes that intellectuals and young people like to engage in, I think should be set aside. And I was very happy that Gandhi and Ambedkar were together on those posters. I think another lesson is for the reinvention of the opposition. The BJP is absolutely right when it says every opposition party is dynastic. It's astonishing that for 2 years the Congress has had has not had an active president, and Sonia Gandhi is still the acting president. The three main people in our main opposition party are from a single family. When the post-mortem to the Bengal election is written, there'll be no question that Mamta's anointing of her nephew as a successor would be one reason to explain the decline in her popularity. So I think the BJP is a party largely of self-made people. It's also a party that has largely shed its Brahmin Banya tag. It's incorporated low caste into its fold. But it's done so in a malevolent way by positioning them against Muslims. By telling Dalits to come into our tent and we will together oppose Muslims and demonize Muslims and stigmatize Muslims. But it has gone about the expansion of its social base in a very clever and systematic way, right? So I think you could even say in a non-sectarian way, right? So I think there are lessons to be learned from all of this. But it's got to be, I think the damage to our institutions is what I worry about. And my column today was principally focused on that. Which will have long-term consequences to restore the autonomy and independence of the judiciary, to restore the autonomy and independence and capability and credibility of the civil service, to think of the police as not acting on the instructions of their political masters. I think the corruption of our institutions, again, something I did talk about, in my column, because there's only so much you can say in 1,200 words, is the regulatory capture of our economic institutions by crony capitalists. I mean, you will see that you talk to top industrialists who do not bear the surnames Adani and Ambani, and you get a sense of how unfairly treated. They would like a level playing field. But do we have a level playing field? When there's a dispute about an airport in Mumbai between two parties and the enforcement directorate goes against one party which is not close to the ruling regime, I mean, what kind of trust can you have in our economic system? So I think the perversion of our institutions to serve the interests of a single party and a single leader will have long-term consequences that we must be aware of. Because, it's very hard. It's very hard to build institutions, very easy to unravel them, to finish them off.
I mean, are we seeing this, Dwindon, Bandyopadhyay? I was looking at this concept of the party society, which the left, I think, in Bengal, do you see a kind of a nationalization of a certain kind of an effort?
Yes. So in fact, this goes by a long time. I wrote a column about a month ago in the Telegraph on the historical parallels between the left and the right. I talked about Dora Russell's visit to Soviet Union and what she said and what we're experiencing now. And I've been struck by this a very long time. In 1998, 1999, when the first NDA regime came to power, and Murli Manohar Joshi, as education minister, was putting people sympathetic to the RSS in prominent universities, I wrote an essay in the EPW in 1999, where I said, Murli Joshi is a Leninist. I called him a Leninist because that's what Lenin would do. Staff the state and the ideological apparatus of the state, such as universities, law courts, with your own men. Right. So absolutely, there's no question that they're striking parallels between the left and the right in the absolutism, in the authoritarianism. And I think I wrote, as I said, do look at this piece I wrote about a month ago on the parallels, historical parallels between the left and the right. I also referenced there the work of the great French historian Francois Furet, who wrote a book called The Passing of an Illusion, which has a chapter on the parallels in the governance styles of Lenin and Hitler. So there's no question, including a cadre-based party, thinking of the party as your family, all this kind of, all these are, some very interesting parallels between the extreme left and the authority. And, I'm not the first to make this kind of, Hannah Arendt, great political philosopher, wrote about this in the 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, see, the reference I mentioned is we're in the process of working on a text which is looking at Turkey, Brazil, and India as the three case studies of trying to understand, what we're titling as the populist seduction. And there we're trying to trace some of these, both socio-political and socio-economic factors that are can be traced as common factors. And this
I wonder if a more cohesive trinity would be Turkey, India, and Russia. I'll tell you why. I will say, I will also be thinking about this. Bolsonaro has just been there one term. One does not know how long he'll be there.
Yeah.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
Okay, let me finish. Modi is likely to get a third term as of now. So Putin, Modi, Erdogan are there for the long haul. More importantly, there's a cultural nationalism, cultural stroke religious nationalism element to all three. You know, Russian orthodoxy, Russian chauvinism, Hindu chauvinism, Islamic there's a soft, basically Erdogan is the Islamist dismantling secular Turkey. Whereas Brazil is really one maverick. Brazil is kind of, one megalomaniac who doesn't have deep ideological convictions, or who doesn't really fuse his identity with the nation, with the long, deep history of the nation. Putin is really going back to Peter the Great. Modi is going back to Shivaji. So in a sense, I'm just now since you mentioned it, I wonder if Russia
might be a good.
Yeah, and Russia also has this kind of oligarchy favoring particular companies and so on that we have now. Yeah,
that's a discussion the publishers that they have been pushing for also. I think
also the use of the intelligence services.
Services, yes.
I don't think in Brazil you have such a systematic, you don't have an NIA or what you have in Russia, the KGB, or what you have in Turkey. The use of the intelligence services to demonize dissenters, to persecute opponents, to arbitrarily put them in jail. Russia, I think, is a more logical fit. So maybe we can have four. You can have four.
Yeah, I just going back to this discussion on Gandhi and Ambedkar, sir, because this is something which is so important, particularly for students. I feel we get into this conversation very often with students here on campus. Of course, we've been missing them, being not able to interact the way we could otherwise. But I want to go back to, again, a column you wrote back in February 2020 about, and you spoke about an interview given by the Kannada writer and activist Devanur Mahadeva, urging Democrats not to view Ambedkar and Gandhi as rivals and adversaries. And he said, in the journey towards true equality, he said they should rather be seen as colleagues and co-workers. Yeah. And Mahadeva said, and I quote you from the column, this is not words, Ambedkar had to awaken the sleeping Dalits and then make the journey. Gandhi had to make the immense effort of uplifting, correcting, changing those who were drowned in Hindu caste religion, in caste wells, to take a step forward. When you see all this, maybe Gandhi would have not traversed far without the presence of Ambedkar. Similarly, I feel that without the liberal, tolerant atmosphere created by Gandhi in the wells of Hindu caste religion, then this cruel Savarna society may not have tolerated Ambedkar as much as it did then. Now, in the environment which is so polarized and divided as such as today, not just on social media, but just the way, we're doing a lot of field work, the way I think we were doing some research on the Delhi pogrom by doing some archiving of victim testimonies, and the kind of communal tension in the air, you could just sense it. Even if you go, even maybe tomorrow, you can just sense that there is that sense of anxiety. How can, in your understanding, those who disagree with one another, right, can give space for collaborative work? Of course, we're going back into the history to look at the kind of subtle influences of Gandhi from Ambedkar and vice versa. Just before you say anything, does a culture of deprecating humor has something to add to this? I don't know. The reason I kind of inserted this point is because you mentioned this in one of your recent interviews, that Gandhi learned about this self-deprecating humor. He was very kind of self-critical about a lot of things he used to feel and say, and learned this from the British to be able to laugh on himself. So any thoughts, something you want to
say? All again, for your students who are listening today, broadening their positions and opening their minds. There's a wonderful book by the late D.R. Nagaraj called The Flaming Feet. And D.R. Nagaraj was a Kannada thinker and writer who also wrote in English, who died tragically young 20 odd years ago. And he was a close friend of Devanur Mahadeva. And I'm sure that Devanur Mahadeva, who only writes in Kannada, is a novelist rather than a sociologist, would have been influenced by Nagaraj. So I'd urge young students interested in how we can understand how Ambedkar and Gandhi transformed one another, and how we can draw on them both now, long after they are gone, to read D.R. Nagaraj's book, The Flaming Feet. It's published by Permanent Black. It is available, I'm told, in a paperback edition. Now, on your question about civilized debate and intercourse, which is more or less impossible today in the age of social media and polarized politics. Last year, a great American civil rights activist died, Congressman John Lewis, who was involved in the civil rights movement, the famous March Across the Bridge. He was a close associate of King, greatly admired Gandhi, set up a King Gandhi Fund, in the US Congress and so on. And I remember seeing an interview of his, and he said, someone asked him, what did you learn from Gandhi? And he said, obviously the obvious things, non-violence, religious toleration, but he said something else. He said, how to disagree without being disagreeable. How to disagree without, and that's something today all of us need to learn. I mean, the kind of mocking, satirical tone that our Prime Minister adopts in his political campaigning is utterly unbecoming of a Prime Minister. I think it's just to demean and cheapen your opponent, to call them personal names, and it brings out the worst in the other person. So Mamata Banerjee will react exactly the same way. So I think how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to be civil and courteous in disagreements, and how to be open-minded and acknowledge where you may have been wrong or where there may actually be a meeting ground. I think that's some of the lessons, that John Lewis was really presenting before us. I mean, because don't accuse your opponent of bad faith. If you think your opponent's arguments are misguided or not founded on empirical research, point it out politely but firmly. But don't say he's doing this because he's paid by so-and-so, because he's a Tory or such and such party. Never, students must learn this in their debates. Never accuse someone you disagree with of bad faith. Take apart their arguments rationally, logically, empirically, but don't impute motive. That's what the greatness of Gandhi. Gandhi never imputed motive. He argued with Jinnah for 30 years, with Ambedkar for 25. He even wrote a letter to Hitler, trying to get Hitler unsuccessfully to change his mind. So I think keep the conversation open and always be civil in your disagreements is, I think, a great lesson all of us can learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this. I remember again, a long time back, that more than 75% of the population in India, which is less than 25, I mean, of course, it would be, the numbers would be slightly different. But yes, it is predominantly a young population, would not know much about Queen Victoria, and and you just kind of added this, that I'd rather add that they would not know of Gandhi either. And this is, I mean, it's a sad kind of state of affairs in the way. I want to just very quickly add an anecdote for a teaching assignment in the summer at a university in Canada, in Ottawa. Carleton, the campus there, has a small statue of Gandhi. I was very surprised from what kind of inspired them, because there are hardly any other figures that are internationally, recognized who are present there. And the statue is located at a point where he's looking at the river, which is a beautiful river that is flowing in. And, we used to spend a little bit of time sitting. I mean, I used to do that over a walk. And the three things that I felt, which was a lesson, because this is connected to the next question, which is something that students wanted very, broadly to ask, and then we'll open it up. One point that was something that I learned from reading, and of course your works have been very influential in that regard, is a renewed version of the idea of the self. The importance of silence and the practice in propriety of silence, and the kind of learnings that made in terms of this point of coming across in being very strong in what you feel and say, and he stuck to his grits on that, but at the same time not being dismissive. The point that you mentioned just now on what others think, I think this is important. In any other way, if one has to look at identifying this, the question which was there for students asking, from Gandhi's own political journey and in your understanding as a biographer, in his own moral evolution, how do you see more than just talking about safeguarding and promoting the aesthetics of democratic values? What is that you think can students or young scholars like ourselves can learn from someone like him, despite his faults and as
of course. Sadiq, again, if I may refer to a recent column of mine, because these are all easily available, and ideally I would want students to read my 2-volume 1800-page biography of Gandhi, but I know that's not, they have other things to do. But I wrote a recent column called The Moral Evolution of Gandhi, where I talked about his views on race, caste, and gender, and how in each of these 3 domains, race, caste, and gender, he began from somewhat fixed, majoritarian, prejudiced positions, and through his conversations and debates and friendships opened his mind and moved towards a more progressive position on all 3. He moved from being a racist to being an anti-racist, from being a typical Hindu patriarch to at least coming halfway to acknowledging the agency of women, from defending caste to opposing caste, and of course consistently opposing untouchability and adopting more and more radical methods to bring untouchability to an end. So I think it often is encounters. It's well known that Ambedkar broadened Gandhi's approach when it came to caste. But before Ambedkar, there was the great Malayali social reformer Narayana Guru, who had challenged the temple entry movement that Gandhi promoted in the 1920s, was as a consequence of his urge to do so by Narayana Guru and his followers. Or women, his friendship with women, including European women in South Africa, very important in his shedding some of his patriarchal prejudices. So I think that's very, very important to have conversations. If Narendra Modi had abandoned, he promised many people through his statements that he was not a Hindu majoritarian when he was elected to power in 2014. But if he had truly, sincerely, emotionally, and psychologically liberated himself from the prejudices of his youth, Gandhi was a racist in his 20s. Narendra Modi joined the RSS, thought of it as a family, and embraced its prejudices, but he has not been able to outgrow them. Here is the tragedy, because in many other ways, there's much to admire about Narendra Modi. He's incredibly hardworking, he's focused, he's committed, he has no family baggage, he's not, he has a deep native intelligence, but he has 2 tragic failures, which, as a consequence of which, he will never be known as a transformative figure he wants to be remembered as. The 2 tragic failures as a human being, as a person, that Narendra Modi has are: 1, his absolute unwillingness to give other people credit. All credit must go to him, not even to his cabinet ministers, let alone to his officials or to science. It's all him. He must take credit for everything. And the blame for a mistake must be somebody else's, the state governments or the IAS officer or whatever. That's his one great. On the contrary, look at Gandhi and his astonishing generosity in acknowledging the contributions of other people and what he learned from other people. And the other, of course, tragic weakness, psychological weakness of Narendra Modi is that he is still emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, and morally an RSS man, which is a Hindu majoritarian. And I think those 2, you could say, personal failures, we are all paying for them, because there are many other things about Modi that are there to admire. His discipline, his capacity for hard work, his inquiring mind, his zest for travel. He could have been a transformative leader had it not been for his deep psychological flaws. That's as a biographer. Here I'm speaking not as a historian, but as someone who also writes about individuals and what shapes them, what makes and unmakes them. I've written, apart from Gandhi, I've written biographies of very relevant and others too. So as a biographer, I'd say, so I think Gandhi had this great capacity to unburden himself of prejudices, to shed them if he found they were mistaken or false, he would just say them. I mean, his journey from being a racist to an anti-racist is an exemplary case of how he grew morally and intellectually, and we can all learn from it.
Yeah, I think this is a point you mentioned to Karan Thapar in this interview with the Wire Dialogues as well, because the reason why I say that it's a question that I think shortly a student is going to ask, because we're going to open it up now. The third point which I was mentioning, because I forgot to kind of add in there, renewed version of the self, value of silence and propriety, self-conduct. And third is the practice of restraint and knowing what limit means, because that influenced a lot of his thinking around economic ideology, which of course both Ambedkar and Nehru were very kind of dismissive about at the time. But if you look at it from the context of the times we're living in now, the economic ideology of kind of a capital accumulation-based thinking, which dominates in a consumer-oriented society, the idea of restraint and limit and the definition of that, I feel, is far influential. It's just not, I mean, it marries the ecological entwinement with economic thought, which has been missing for, I don't know when, since the emergence of neoclassical thought and economic thinking as well. So that's thank you sir for that. I want to get Tejaswini in, because this idea on political psychology that you mentioned is something which is a question I think she wanted to get in, and I want her to ask her question, and then there are a few questions that are in the chat box. I request others, if they have anything, to please mention it here. And we're going to, of course, because we have around 20-25 minutes to wrap up. Yeah, please, Tejaswini, go ahead.
Good evening, Professor. It was an absolute honor to have you over at Samvaad, and the last hour has been incredibly insightful. Actually, I did reference, I mean, I went through your interview with Karan Thapar for the Y in 2018, while, you were discussing the leadership skills of Modi as India's parliament's chief executive. You had mentioned that a student had told you that, sir, I'm just quoting you, Narendra Modi thinks he's like Chhatrapati Shivaji, and with this difference, right? So Chhatrapati Shivaji, though he was called an emperor, controlled only a small part of Western India, but Modi is the first Hindu Samrat to control all of India. Right. And then you said that this is his self-perception. That is why he cannot share credit. So I was just wondering that, as a historian, what do we sort of make out of the reasons behind this sort of personalistic cult image and narcissistic sort of self-perception that is evident in such political figures? Is this socio-political phenomenon more common in many key national or even regional figures in India's own social and political history? For instance, Nehru or Indira Gandhi and Modi. So that was my question.
Yeah. Sure. And of course, Ambedkar had talked about it in his last speech to the Constituent Assembly. He had famously warned against the dangers of bhakti in politics. He said, bhakti in religion may be a route to the salvation of the soul, but bhakti in politics is a likely road to dictatorship. And I'm quoting from memory, but he said something like this. He said, however great a man's contributions to a country, you must not lay down your liberties at his feet. And he probably had, when he made these remarks in 1949, November 1949, Ambedkar probably had both Gandhi in mind, because Gandhi had been dead less than 2 years, and Nehru in mind, because Nehru was this towering colossus as prime minister, right? But he was prescient about Indira Gandhi. We laid our liberties at her feet, because we made her this great iconic figure who represented the country herself, who was portrayed as Durga, who won us the war against Pakistan, and whose Congress president said India is Indira and Indira is India. And of course, now about Narendra Modi. And it's also true in other spheres of life. I mean, it should be true of state chief ministers, Jayalalitha, for example, or even people who have not held power, like Bal Thackeray. And Bal Thackeray was a kind of emperor-like figure in Bombay, where industrialists and film stars would go and bow at his feet. Our deification of our sports people, like Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli. So I think we suspend our critical faculties when confronted with power and charisma. And it's been true in other societies as well. It's not that it's unique to us, But I'd just like to say one thing in the context of politics, because I've been thinking about this quite a lot. If you look at, we've had three really charismatic prime ministers: Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and Modi. But it's likely that it's the uncharismatic prime ministers who left a more enduring legacy. So Shastri, by nurturing the Green Revolution and by building up our defense capacity after our humiliating loss against China in 1962. Narasimha Rao, by opening up the economy. Vajpayee, by showing how to run a collaborative, multi-party coalition, in a non-dictatorial, collegial way. So it's actually charisma, according too many powers to an individual, giving that individual, bestowing them with extraordinary gifts. They know everything, they can do everything, they can single-handedly transform India, can be dangerous for the country. I mean, Indira Gandhi, certainly I think the legacy of Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee and Shastri has been much more positive than the legacy of Indira and Modi. Nehru's best years as Prime Minister was when he was first among equals, when he had Patel and Ambedkar and Pant and others with him in a cabinet, checking him. When he became all-powerful and this great man whom no one could challenge, that's when he started making, major mistakes. So I think charisma is a two-edged sword. I think even in other countries, the world leader today, who's likely to be remembered as a truly transformative leader, is Angela Merkel, who has the charisma of a dead fish. Right. And who never tweets, who's never boasting about what she has done and so on. Right. So I think these are some broader lessons from being skeptical of the aura of greatness, especially when it's claimed by the person concerned. But in India, particularly, Ambedkar had warned us against the dangers of bhakti in politics. And I think the examples of Indira Gandhi and Narendra Modi, bear out wisdom of Ambedkar's warning.
So, sir, because we have, I think, roughly around 20 minutes of time, and there are a few questions that have been put out, and I'll take a couple of them if it's all right with you, and put it across, and then accordingly you can
Sure.
respond. Before that, I think this point you mentioned about having, another person as a check on yourself in the opposing force, and I think that's something which clearly says a lot about the state of the national level opposition.
Yes.
And with someone who's been kind of coerced into becoming this countervailing force, which he may not be. I don't want to kind of get into names, but just that's an important, I think, point for everyone to be wary of. There is a question from Suryansh Pathak, and this is connected with something we had earlier identified, but I think he captures it well. The capture and compliance of institutions is a real threat. If we talk about how things will get better, it seems like a stretch to say change in leadership alone would bring, let's say, a different PM. But what do you think about the nature of how, the institutions that you talk about are being affected, like, the Election Commission to a certain extent now, and finding it difficult to, so how do we salvage an institution? Just a connecting point here is about academic freedom in public universities as well, a point which, I think is increasingly becoming more and more. I mean, I know if you talk about Binayak Sen and story of around people in Chhattisgarh and other areas, it's not a new issue, but at the level it is, we know it even in private institutions, you're not secured. So any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, again, empirically, the evidence seems to suggest that majority governments are bad for Indian institutions.
Mm.
You give a leader like Rajiv Gandhi 400 seats or Modi 300 seats, and the institutions capitulate. If you have, 180 seats, you run a multi-party coalition like Narasimha Rao or Manmohan Singh or Vajpayee did, then independent mandate bureaucrats can push back. The judges can be braver. Then the Reserve Bank can say, we will listen to experts, not what the finance minister wants. So that's just the empirical evidence. But I think one needs more courage from individuals. We need judges of the Supreme Court to stand up for what they believe in, and particularly chief justices, because they are the masters of the roster. I mean, they need to stand up. They need to recognize that it's the editors of newspapers need to stand up. Vice chancellors need to stand up. If one of their professors is targeted unfairly, rather than leaving it to the board of governors, vice chancellors need to stand up. So I think some individuals also need to develop a spine. We have become, in that respect, a spineless society. We capitulate to the leader, whatever happens, right? And I think Gandhi taught people to have a spine. You know, again, among the intellectuals I greatly admire, Deepanshu, are three people who are not very well known today, but they shaped me when I was growing up. One was the anthropologist, very relevant. The other was Nirmal Kumar Bose, also an anthropologist. And the third was an economist called J.C. Kumarappa. And they all worked closely with Gandhi, and they all disagreed with Gandhi. Nirmal Bose who had the moral courage to disagree with Gandhi, right? So that, and today a vice chancellor cannot disagree with his chairman of the board because the chairman of the board has got a call from the PMO about a professor saying, get rid of a professor. So individuals also need to develop a spine.
No, I totally agree.
That's something which, so, you know, Fali Nariman, for example,
yeah.
When the emergency was proclaimed, Fali Nariman was additional solicitor general. He resigned that day and went back to Bombay. He just said, I cannot serve in this regime. I'm going back to Bombay, right? So I think, of course, it's tough. You need to keep your job. But I think it's individuals in institutions who lead these institutions must show a resolution in pushing back against malign interference.
No, I totally agree, because from personal experience, and a few people know this, I faced something similar last year. It was just the higher administration standing up to kind of looking at it.
Good for them, yeah.
It's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, it's at this point of time, it doesn't.
I mean, you know, I should say this, since you mentioned your case, I can mention my case. In 2017, in 2018, I was prevented from joining Ahmedabad University. Right. The next year, I got a chair at the Indian Institute of Science. The director of the Indian Institute of Science got a call from the Ministry of Education, from actually a party functionary in the Ministry of Education, saying, dismiss this guy. He did. He stood up. Right. Now, mine was a one-year appointment, so I completed my year, and then, you know, but absolutely. I mean, so that's I think something where you know, more Indians should recognize the importance. The institution is not beholden to a party or to a particular regime.
Yeah, I just want to kind of get in a couple of questions, because I know we stretched on time, but Abhijit and Professor Ramachandran's question here. Abhijit asks, can we be be optimistic about the younger generation if they're systematically being, let's say, you know, brainwashed through a propagandic form of communique into a majoritarian mindset, like, you know, you see in China, or like, you know, the way a lot of the tendencies that is there, just to kind of get in another thought, that is ruling parties exercising their will on structures of government is not new to a, let's say, given. I mean, you've talked about this before in our talk today. Is how Congress flourished in the 60s and 70s. What do you think has changed? I think you've talked about this in a way, in a certain way, that what's so unique about the current system. But again, just to kind of talk a little in reference to the case of the younger generation being exposed to a certain form of communication by a propagandist media, and the kind of discourse on social media is deeply kind of toxic to a certain extent beyond a point. What is that you suggest that?
So what I suggest for young people today, in terms of that, you talked about silence. I'll tell you what I've been trying to do over the last few months to be relatively sane and to focus on my work. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
Your young people, you focus on your studies, your interests, your profession, right? And do that as sincerely and honestly as committed way as possible, you know. And the background, to save yourself with the background noise. So the one things I do, even though I write on a current affairs column, is I don't look at Twitter after 11 a.m. You know, I go to scroll at Indian Express to the headlines, but I want to focus on my work. I don't want to be distracted. And I also spend almost every evening, today is an exception because I'm talking to you, Deepanshu and your colleagues, between 6 and 7:30, I'm listening to Hindustani classical music in the
Classical music. I know.
Keep it up. So I think, but I think those are ways in which you can focus on your inner self, on your own thoughts, on your own growth, on your own sanity. And I think those can help, immensely.
Couldn't agree more. Jaya Bonham asks, and of course, I think based on our work, she's asked this question. So I want to get this. Did the BJP start as a right-wing ideology since the inception? Because when I started going through their first manifesto, I know we've not, I think, done work, so you won't kind of comment into they have, the manifesto between 51-7, they've rejected the complete idea of nationalism, and they've mentioned that they have started as a centrist party, and also mentioned they have in fact been subjected to attacks from extreme left and right. So do you think the BJP shaped its ideology as per the situational circumstance of the country from time to time, or do you think there is
I think I would like to, probably Jaya is referring to the manifestos of the BJP in the early 1980s. The Jansangh in the early 1950s started as a conservative right-wing Hindu party. And the RSS and the Jansangh worked very closely together in the 50s and the 60s. Then you had the Janta experiment, which failed on the question of dual membership. And when the Jansangh merged in the Janta Party, when the Janta Party broke, the BJP, for a brief period, called itself Gandhian Socialist and tried to rebrand itself as a non-Hindu party. But with the Ayodhya movement, of course, it went back to its original roots, which are in a kind of soft Hindutva. And it's become, of course, with Modi and Shah, it's become more and more aggressive. I mean, even Advani would not have used the language that Modi and Shah are using in Bengal. Right. So that would not. So I think it's now become more and more hardline, more and more majoritarian since 2014.
The final question, Tarini, I think was a student, also works the center. She asked, and I think this is a follow-up from something you mentioned before, when you spoke about Gandhi's evolution from being a racist in his 20s to evolving his views over a period of time. In this context, as you pointed out, Gandhi took responsibility for his views and actions in a way that, he could be maybe forgiven, at least the way, the perception that goes out. But as Modi, you point out, is unwilling to change and admit to some of his psychological flaws, how do we find or hold our leaders accountable and, let's say, forgive them at the same time, or should we forgive them? I don't know.
I think we should not be, they have power over us for good and for ill. I mean, one could have given Modi the benefit of the doubt for the first year of the next 2 years, But if 6 years into his rule, he says, I can know the protesters by the clothes they're wearing. I mean, what does this mean? This means that he basically doesn't trust Muslims. Whatever he may say in public. He may have a photo op with, in a metro with some bearded men, skull cap and bearded men. But this is a person who cannot change. Well, look at what's happening in Maharashtra today. Why are cabinet ministers blaming the state government? Even if the state government has committed some mistakes, at a time of great national crisis, shouldn't they be just getting the vaccine across? So I think these are things in which this is so partisan. This government is really so much interested in power at all costs, regardless of the consequences, that I personally can't give them any benefit. I mean, after 7 years, one can't give them any benefit.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. I want to take this time now to kind of wrap up our conversation, and indelibly thank you for taking the time out. We hope you catch up on the music that I believe you check it out on YouTube. There are these long 1 hour. I was last year, classical music was the way I got through the lockdown, because we were in Sonipat. Situation was bad. It's close to campus, and I think music was a way in which one can kind of really, go deeper and reflect on one's own conduct. But just to say something before, and for students and colleagues who are present, thank you so much, Shubham, from the IT team. I know we had a small glitch with respect to getting ourselves live on YouTube, but I've recorded the conversation, so it shouldn't be an issue. But there's something which I want to say that really inspires a few of us from Professor Guha's work. I know as a scholar, he's done so much, but I think a few things that as in more personal space, if one is allowed to mention, my training is also in the field of economics, but I think I've deviated extensively away from what the neoclassical, and I see that the school of thought that dominated economics has kind of really eluded me. Moved towards anthropology. We are kind of within the center using ethnography and bringing ethnographic tools in economic research. That's the commitment that we have kind of put in. But one thing that I think the reason that gave a few of us the confidence to do that was the fact that you emphasize so much that being grounded in the area of work that you do in the vocation and being open-minded, is something so critical to the life of a scholar whose service is, to committed to the understanding of the world as against, thinking about changing the world. This is something which, remember one of your recent interviews, a lot of people want to change the world, but it's also a service to understanding the world that, few of us feel that I think it's important. And lastly, bringing a more comparative and relativist perspective, in our scholarship. So with that, I bring this conversation of Samvaad to a close. We had this as our final dialogue this semester. We have 3 that we schedule. And thank you so much, sir, for the time. And
thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.